Good evening. Today is Wednesday, August 25th, 2021, and this is a special meeting and study session of the Romulus Community Schools Board of Education. Pursuant to Senate Bill 1108, we are still under a Wayne County Local Public Health Department emergency epidemic, and board members will be joining us remotely and in person. We are being streamed live on YouTube for the public who would like to join. Madam Secretary, if you would please call the roll, and board members joining remotely, please state your location.
Terrell,
Present, Romulus, Michigan.
Files,
Present.
Kennard, Wester, Evans present, German,
Present, County, Romulus.
Bergeron,
Bergeron is absent.
okay, was Kennard present? I could not hear.
Not yet.
Okay.
Thank you. We have a quorum. This meeting is called to order at 5:15 p.m. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I move that the Board of Education accept the meeting agenda as presented. Is there support?
Support,
Is that Evitz?
correct,
Moved by Piles, supported by Evitz. Madam Secretary, will you please call the vote?
Terrell,
Yes.
Piles,
Yes.
Wester, Evans, yes, German,
Yes.
is Kennard logged in yet?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you.
We are in closed session at 5:16 p.m. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm letting Mr. Weaver, I'm sorry, hang on. I'm sorry, board members. We have a request for closed session tonight under Section 8H of the Open Meetings Act, attorney-client privilege. The closed session will take place in a separate session for those joining us on YouTube. The meeting will remain open until the board returns from the closed session. Is there support?
Support,
Moved by Piles, supported by Evitz. Roll call, Madam Secretary.
Wester, Evans, yes, German,
Yes.
Piles,
Yes.
Terrell,
Yes.
We are in closed session at 5:17. Wait a minute, end stream, no. No, you don't want to end stream? No, I don't want to end stream. I did the transition, and so it should kick over here, right?
So they're going back into the original one, right?
Yes, and we're actually live now, but
I think we're scheduled for like an hour, I believe. Yeah.
who has joined? No, he's gone. So he told me what to do, and I think I did it.
So we're trying to figure out how to get our presentation out.
Yeah, we didn't know when that.
I sent it to Mr. Cooper. We do have handouts.
We need to see it though.
I mean, I can use one of the handouts as well if somebody's not here,
You
but
can actually have two handouts,
yeah.
Oh, yeah, we can.
because let me see.
Probably didn't know that they were gonna, show theirs, but then they were gonna show us how to set it up.
Right, no,
Yeah.
I sent it.
I feel relatively confident I could figure it out as long as I had
Okay.
cable to connect my laptop to the system.
I'm gonna turn down the mics for a minute.
Like escape and USB. Well, Mr. Cooper sets up a neat system to look if there are any access cables.
If the computer shows everything from his computer, he would show it
You know
from
what?
his.
Oh, would he? Did he take us with it?
Especially with us, he would show it from there, if, you know.
Yeah, unfortunately, if he was here, yeah.
I don't think he told him that he needed to, you know.
And I thought maybe they would have us kind of late, so I brought my own laptop, but I don't have to hook it up
Yeah,
to
if we were at the board office, then you would be able to.
Chipotle.
There's cables, I don't know. Oh, Kennard?
I have a cable socket.
Judy, are you there? I see Judy popped up. Let's see anybody else.
There's 7 people connected, it looks like.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
We're just trying to see who else was on.
Oh, I'm driving.
No, I looked at that.
We're live too, Judy, so.
Thank you for letting me know.
Is lost. We have a tub of cable-looking things. I can either confirm or deny what you need. But, just say, here's the presentation for tonight.
That's who's connected right now. This is, that's who's connected right now.
Oh, I'm sorry, who's there? Thank you.
Mr. Terrell, Ms. Kennard,
Oh.
Ms. Evans,
Okay.
Dr. Edmondson.
Thank you. Okay. So, you want to, thank you. Okay. Is there a motion to reconvene in open session? Motion made by Wester. Is there support? I will support. Madam Secretary, are you connected? Board members on the Google Meet, are you able to hear me? Ms. Kennard, are you able to hear? I think I turned up the mics.
Ms. Kennard has left the meeting.
Yeah. We didn't do anything, just the mics.
Could be, as I said, it's freezing up. I don't know if that.
Okay. No, you're fine. The mics are, these are the mics, they're up. Mics are up. How do we unmute, are they, oh, they are muted, aren't they?
Oh, well, it looks like
How do we
Ms.
unmute
Trell is
them?
muted. No, they have to.
Board members, are you able to unmute yourselves?
Yeah, because it's saying you can't, like, you just try to unmute, you can't unmute someone else and say it, so.
Themselves, I think, yeah.
They can't hear me.
They can or cannot.
They cannot hear me, and I turn. Turn the mics up like,
I did not touch that.
no, we know.
I just went online. I
I'm just
promise.
saying, by the time, just going over, because we were able to hear her and she was able to hear us.
Got it.
Because I had told her that we were live. And she was
So
like,
what is, these are the volume controls.
Terrell said she doesn't see anybody now.
Does she see the table?
Evans just said they do not see the board table.
I think that little.
Desktop audio is active. Floor mic is active. Webcam is active.
Yeah, so this is what they see right now. Is this little thing on the bottom of the screen? Romulus symbol.
I think send out a studio. Was that you, Anya?
Must have been when she tried to sign, I bet you when you
Oh, I
signed
signed out of the
Gmail.
Gmail account so I could get into mine because I emailed the presentation to
Yes,
myself. I didn't
yes,
realize
you
it was.
took us
So
out
that's what
of the
happened.
Oh, I'm
Google
sorry
Meet.
Oh,
about that.
okay.
I didn't realize it was. But why would it have to?
You took us out of the Google Meet because it was in.
Because we have to,
It was in.
Oh
through
goodness.
Gmail.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
let's see. Ben
Shoot.
Cooper. We're going to hopefully get it. Better you than me.
That's exactly what happened, yeah. Yep.
It logged out.
That's why it was moving me. Well, in that case, I mean, the board, the board does, have the packet of slides and.
They can't hear.
I know, we gotta get logged in back in.
Oh, right.
And if the
right, right,
public,
right.
if anyone is watching on YouTube and can hear me speaking, will you please notify a board member? Thank you.
Do we have the login?
I'm gonna get now.
Because once we get back in, then we can.
So you can hear on YouTube. Okay, those watching on YouTube, please stand by.
I think the YouTube might be connected to the other one, probably, the other.
So, and you can hear us? Okay, so we just need the board members to be able to. Here's what I'll do.
Yeah, because the other computer is still active and going.
Will you connect Ben on your phone, please? Okay. So I'm going to connect the board members on my phone. They have to be able to hear.
No, I was trying to see who can start receiving. Yeah.
For those watching on YouTube, we're sorry for the delay. All right. Oh, my phone's going to die. Have you called Ben? Okay, we hook up. Just hook up anyone and tell me who.
Do you not have anyone who knows the password?
I sent a text out. I do just for now, and then I want it changed in the morning. Okay, stand by. I have to hook up other board members.
Oh, we're doing this over the phone?
Yeah, because we can't, we're logged out of the Google account. Hang on. Look how resilient we are. Enroll your kids at Romulus Community Schools. We can handle a glitch. Okay.
Miss Mel, do you have an extra copy of the introduction? Here.
Hey, stand by, please.
leave your message for
I have Sue and Denisa. I'm trying Judy and Nicole. I got voicemail for both of them.
I know she said she was driving.
Right.
hello. Sorry your call was missed. Leave a message and your phone call.
Okay. So what we will do is okay.
Yeah.
We have a quorum, and then we will wait to see if I hear from Ms. Kennard or Ms. German. So there,
Ms. Newman might not be available.
okay, so I move to reconvene in open session.
Support.
Okay, moved by Piles, supported by Wester. Madam Secretary, will you call the vote, please?
Lester.
Present.
Terrell.
Yes.
Evans, yes. Piles.
Yes. Yes.
Kennard.
Not here.
German.
Not here.
Bergeron is absent. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have a, Bergeron is excused. We are back in open session at 6:46 p.m. We are now moving into the training session of our meeting. It is our annual training for illegal harassment and discrimination. And tonight we are joined by Mr. Robert Schindler and Ms. Anya Lusk from Miller Johnson Law Firm. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for being here tonight. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So should I speak toward this mic to make sure people hear me, or how's that gonna work? I don't know. I wanna make sure people can hear, so. Actually, yeah, take this. I just wanna make sure people hear, that's all. Hello? All right, that'll work.
Much better.
All right, excellent. So, one, sorry about the technical glitches going on right now. In part, I know we were trying to load our PowerPoint so it could be seen as part of the presentation. That we have not been able to make that work. So instead, I know that the board had passed out handouts. I don't know if people have them at home as well. But we'll go through, as far as the PowerPoint goes. If not, I know we'll make sure that everyone has it and has an opportunity to look at it and download it. But thank you guys for having us today. Anya and I are here to talk about discrimination and harassment in the workplace. Again, this is a training to help us understand and frame our thinking about what harassment is, what discrimination is, what our responsibilities are as an employer to deal with it, and how to respond. So, first, so why is that important? Well, first, liability, right? We're lawyers, so we have to talk about liability. So, of course, if there are issues with discrimination and harassment, liability can occur. That can occur, one, to the school district. In order for liability to attach to a school district, there are rules. But if harassment is known or should be known of, and we don't do enough to prevent it, then it can attach to the district itself, and liability can occur. There can be personal liability for administrators. If an administrator has knowledge of harassment ongoing and fails to act properly relative to that harassment or discrimination, then they could potentially be liable as well. And that could be liability that would be outside the protections that we often have in the law, right? Many times school administrators have protections for governmental immunity and the like, and those protections are not there for harassment or discrimination claims. Potential liability also includes things like compensatory damages, meaning actual damages of money lost for somebody for their job, potentially, punitive damages, and even attorney fees and costs. So it can be a pretty significant issue if harassment occurs. And of course, you know, one of the main things is, as a school district, it's bad for our reputation. If harassment is occurring, as a school district, you know, we are in a service industry. And so we have to think about retaining our students, about attracting other students. And when you have an environment where you have issues like that, it gets publicity, it creates bad public relations. So, in addition to that, why else is it important? Now, those are sort of the big external liability things, but there are a lot of other reasons why preventing and dealing with issues relating to harassment and discrimination are important. Employee dignity and morale. Obviously, people want to work in a place where they feel respected, and harassment, discrimination can lead to not only problems for dignity and morale for those who are facing the harassment, but can also affect many others who witness this or know of it or the like. Two, again, you know, on the slide here, job security. People don't feel safe and secure in a job where they believe that discrimination or harassment could occur or is occurring. Quality of work suffers, productivity suffers. In the end, one of the points that we get to when we look at what harassment is that it affects people's ability to do their job. And so not only is there sort of a morale issue, but there is an actual productivity issue. People can't work when they're in an environment when they feel unsafe because of harassment or discrimination. That leads to higher turnover and can be difficult to hire and retain a diverse workplace, you know, like we would want. So there are numerous anti-discrimination laws on slide 4 here that we need to think of when it comes to discrimination. So what is discrimination? Well, there's Title VI, Title VII, Title IX. These are all federal statutes. Title VII, for example, deals with harassment or discrimination in the workplace. Title IX deals with student sexual discrimination in particular. So there's that. There's the Americans with Disabilities Act, obviously, that deals with discrimination based on the status of being disabled. Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which affects any employee over the age of 40. Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act. Those are all federal statutes. And then Michigan has what's called the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act and the Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act. Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act is similar to the federal Title VII, although it includes more classifications than even Title VII does. Title VII looks at race, religion, gender, and creed. And then the Elliott Larson, as you see on the next slide, adds, or actually 2 slides later, adds some standards to it. And we'll get to those in a minute. But there's also the Persons with Disabilities Civil Rights Act, which is similar to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. All right, so moving on to slide 5. What is harassment? What is discrimination? We quote the policy language here in the slide, but it's important to understand we use these words a lot in society now, right? I'm feeling harassed, I'm feeling discriminated against, but these are important legal terms, and sometimes they get used in a broader context. So we need to understand that, one, harassment itself is a concept that comes out of discrimination law. So, you know, Title IX, ADA, all of these statutes are not harassment statutes, they're discrimination statutes. They say that one person can't be discriminated against because of their race, because of their religion, because of their gender, disability status, etc. Harassment, the concept of harassment, has really developed out of discrimination law. And it began specifically with sex-based discrimination laws, and we looked at the notion of harassment from there. And so it began really, again, with sex-based and then race-based. We saw a lot of the early litigation when it came to discrimination in the 1960s and 70s, after many of these federal acts were passed, began to develop this harassment law, which says discrimination, when we think of discrimination, it's you don't get a job or you don't get a promotion because of your race, because of religion. Harassment law developed to say, well, no, really discrimination is more than that. It also means that you're put in a bad position, that you're negatively affected in your ability to do your job because you're treated poorly because of your race, because of your religion, because of gender, etc. So harassment is really a subset of discrimination law. And that's why if you look at, and then policy 8006 talks specifically about, what discrimination is in the purpose of the board policy. It says, the Board of Education is committed to maintaining a learning and working environment in which all individuals are treated with dignity and respect, free from illegal discrimination and harassment. There will be no tolerance for discrimination or harassment on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, marital status, sexual orientation, genetic information, disability, age, or any other basis prohibited by law. So what's prohibited by law? The next slide gets to that. That's what I mentioned. The Michigan statute, the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, creates other bases that aren't included in the federal statutes. These include things like height, weight, familial status, etc. So that's when we get to this notion of harassment and discrimination based on legal status. So there's legal and illegal discrimination and harassment. So it talks there in slide 6 about, rude, aggressive, threatening, intimidating, discourteous, bullying, inappropriate, insubordinate, etc. behavior is worth reporting, and that supervisors should discipline as necessary. So in policy, we often make this view of illegal harassment because in the end, people could engage in activity that would otherwise be harassment, but if it's not based upon one of these protected classifications, then it wouldn't be illegal harassment. It would just simply be harassment of some other form. Generally speaking, that's what we think of as bullying. Bullying is basically harassment, but not based upon a protected classification. Debbie, do you have a question?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So, if I'm in a work environment and my superior is making like short jokes or
Right.
calling me shorty or just, that is not harassment, that's rude?
No, that one actually could be harassment because...
Or is it only harassment if I'm denied a promotion
No,
because of?
That's a great question. So Michigan is one of the areas where height is, for example, a basis for discrimination laws under Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, right? So federal statutes don't include that. Michigan, we expanded it, and height is in fact one. So if your supervisor was making short jokes all the time and you said to your supervisor, please stop that, I don't appreciate it, and they continued to do so to the point where it made you uncomfortable and made you not want to work or affected your work productivity, that would amount to illegal harassment. Because at that point, now your workplace is being negatively affected because because of unwanted jokes, comments, etc. about height.
But, so when it has the rude, aggressive, threatening, intimidating, just all of that, is that harassment or is that just worth reporting but not really the
Yeah.
basis of harassment?
So it could be the basis of harassment, and that's why we say it's worth reporting. When you have that kind of activity, it's important to report it so that way it can be investigated properly, and we can determine whether it is simply bad behavior or if it's harassment. Now, don't get me wrong. this is where sometimes people get confused by this. Well, if it's not harassment, then it's okay, right? Well, no, right? I mean, no one wants to work in a workplace where they feel like they have aggressive, rude, et cetera behavior. So it could be unprofessional, it could be inappropriate, but it may not rise to the level of illegal discrimination or harassment. But if you have those things, it's important to report because then you can investigate and ensure.
Right.
If we know about these things, these aggressive behaviors and the like, and we don't report, and it turns out that it is in fact discrimination or harassment, that's when, as we mentioned before, that liability can occur, right? So if I know that this behavior is going on, especially let's say if I'm a supervisor and I see this within my department, and I don't do anything about it, I don't report it, I just think, oh, it's just so-and-so, it's just Joe being Joe, this is how he is, right? Well, in the end, if then that person files a lawsuit that says they're being harassed by Joe, and it turns out to be, true, then that liability can flow to those people who knew and didn't do anything about it. And that's why it's important to report, because sometimes if we're there in the workplace, we don't have the ability to make those judgments necessarily about what is and what is not harassment. Oh, I think we may have a password so we can maybe get things logged back on. We'll see. All right. So, and truthfully, a lot of people, the American workplace is a difficult and is a stressful place. And schools are definitely no exception to that, especially in our current day and age with COVID and with everything going on. I can tell you, given the phone calls and letters and different things that I've been dealing with over the last several days, schools are not always easy places to work. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I know that a lot of phrases have been normalized
Yeah.
in American culture.
For sure.
And that's just long-standing. And so, but now as we attempt to learn more, know more, and do better, are we looking at normalized phrases that if they continue, although once normalized, could now be considered racial discrimination or harassment?
Explain.
I guess anything that could be said that became a stereotype phrase.
Okay.
And knowing
Yeah.
that it was rooted against this particular group
Sure.
of people, it's just used.
Yeah. So, and oftentimes what you see is those phrases like that are used within subgroups or within, in terms of normalization. What I would say is more often than not, if a word is rooted in sort of traumatic treatment of people, I would never probably get to the point of it feeling comfortable with it being normalized into the workplace.
Right.
Whether that, and there's a lot of different versions of that
Yes.
you can find in society, with any sort of group or subgroup that's been that's been discriminated against historically, you can see that. And so, if you have those usages, I would recommend keeping them out of the workplace.
Right.
Even if you have a group of people that you would normally be part of the subgroup that it would be considered to normally be okay with.
Right. And I'm not saying that is part of our work culture
Right.
here, but does it charge us with a higher level of responsibility to learn and be aware of those? Or if we are told, hey, you shouldn't say that, that's offensive to me, not dismiss it like, no, it's not, I didn't mean it like that, but to
Right.
note it, because if we don't, we could end up in a situation we'd rather not be in.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all probably have ideas of or understanding of words that are offensive, and if they're being used, I think we have a responsibility to make sure that they're not being used. And if the excuse is, well, it's okay because of X, Y, or Z,
Right.
I'll pick on myself, right? Because I'm of German heritage. My parents were German immigrants, right? So growing up, even again within our German subgroups, there was you call it Germans Krauts, or you use phrases like that. So oftentimes if my uncles are sitting around and they're playing cards and they're joking, they might use that phrase with each other as a joke. But if they're in the workplace, even if they're talking to the same subgroup, they shouldn't be using that phrase in the workplace because it sends a bad message,
Right.
is what
Thank
I would
you.
say. As we note in slide 7 here, 20% of Americans find the workplace to be hostile or threatening. Studies show, a Harvard UCLA study shows that American workplace is grueling, stressful, and surprisingly hostile. Nearly 55% say they face, quote, unpleasant and potentially hazardous conditions at work. Is this a trend? Is this reality? What is the situation? Now, I do think, and this is part of, again, in terms of phrase usage, understanding, hostile work environment, right? That's a phrase that oftentimes gets thrown around as well. And Anya's going to talk more about hostile work environment in a little bit. But sometimes when the phrase hostile work environment is used, it gets used in the sense of I'm unhappy with the way I'm being treated at work. When in reality, from a legal context, the hostile work environment means something else. Right. Again, it's a subset of harassment. And it's important to understand that difference, that not every person who's unhappy in the workplace is facing a hostile work environment from a legal context. So, what can supervisors do when it comes to these things? Well, we can recognize the importance of a positive workplace culture. We can make clear rules for reporting both legal and potentially illegal behavior. Again, because what we don't want is we don't want individual employees having to make that determination as to whether this is legal or illegal behavior. If it meets those sort of rules of that overly aggressive, hostile behavior, we should report and allow HR or whomever else to then sort through that process. Because, everybody isn't a lawyer. They're not going to know the difference between what is illegal and illegal harassment. It's important for us to have, for an organization to have clear complaint procedures and a structure so people know where to go if they have concerns. Not everything has to turn into a formal investigation or a process, but we need to have people who make that decision on whether there is, in fact, a necessity to have an investigation or begin that process, and people need to know where to go, so that if they have a concern, if there is a problem, they can do so. We give examples here, right? Teachers go to their building principal, who goes to HR. Central office goes to the director of HR, goes to superintendent, board president, etc. And then, at that point, swift but fair investigation, potentially discipline, potentially restorative processes to continue to move forward in the workplace, and address that in a means that not only, one, addresses the concerns, but stops any potential discrimination or harassment that's going on. So, the first step is recognizing harassment complaints. And this is not always as simple as it would appear, right? More often than not, when people are put in situations, they don't want to be the one ringing the bell. It is uncomfortable to be somebody who reports your supervisor, even a coworker, heck, even somebody underneath you, if you believe they're engaging in discriminatory or harassing behavior, it's an uncomfortable thing to sort of, go and talk about. Right? We have all kinds of phrases for people like that in our society, right? You're a snitch, right? But the reality is people need to understand that if they see these sorts of things, it can potentially destroy the workplace, and they need to feel free to be able to go and talk about it, because that's an important thing. So when somebody does come to report, oftentimes, because it is uncomfortable, it's not always very easy to tell. Most people don't step forward and say, there has been an engagement of illegal harassment in this form or another. It's a violation of Title VII. yada, yada, yada. Like that isn't the way the world works, right? Instead, it's so-and-so's making me uncomfortable. And so we need to know, have a process to say, okay, this is something that needs to go to the right person, and they need to dig into this issue to see what this is, right? Joe's making me uncomfortable. Well, if Joe's making you uncomfortable, is that just because, what? Joe had garlic for lunch and he smells, and so you're uncomfortable being around him? Or is Joe engaging in sexual harassment? I mean, there's a big gap in between there of what that could mean. So it's important that we have somebody who's going to look into it. And again, it's not always easy, right? I can think of a situation I had many years ago in a school district where, a woman teacher had made a complaint about a male teacher. The principal investigated it, and the principal thought at that time and did her investigation thinking this is just simply sort of somebody who's being obnoxious, who's engaging in sort of rookie hazing of this new teacher, that sort of thing. Years later, this same teacher stands up at a board meeting and says she was sexually harassed, and this principal didn't do anything about it. And then I had to come in and do an investigation and try and figure it all out. And when it came down to it, I think the principal probably was working on the information she had. But we need to make sure that we know what we're dealing with, and we need to document that and learn about it and figure it out, so that way it's not only clear what we believe, but we communicate clearly as to what we find. Yeah, go ahead, Debbie.
In that instance, the investigation, the building administrator didn't find harassment. Is there an appeal process that employee could go through rather than just down the road put it out there at a board meeting?
Yeah, oftentimes there is. In this case, I'm trying to remember if there was an appeal process there. But yeah, generally speaking, there are means to move things forward to an appeal, and try and get a different view. If HR says no, it's not harassment, then generally you're going to go to the superintendent from there if you don't believe that that's correct. And so there is a process by which to do so. So recognizing harassment complaints. One, again, we need to, when we hear a complaint, when somebody discusses a complaint, we need to consider the facts. What does this look like? What kind of comments are we talking about? In this case, in the case that I mentioned, for example, the one teacher would say things like, oh, in the teacher's lounge, oh, you got to wash the dishes because you're the new person, or these sorts of things. Okay, so looking at that, we need to look at who's making the statements, what the statements are, what does this look like? So we need to consider those facts. And then when we're talking about whether something is harassment or not, it's not just a matter of, yeah, this feels really bad, right? Harassment, discrimination, that's not a gut check sort of thing. We need to look at the facts, and we need to compare it to policy. Policy is going to tell us what harassment is and what discrimination is. There are definitions for these things by law and by policy and regulation. So it's important that we compare to that notion. A lot of times, right, I talk here about the he said, she said myth. One of the ideas is, well, we can't really do anything about it. It's he said, she said. Nobody else was around for it, so we can't really do much. Well, that's not true. In the end, is it harder in those scenarios when there's no other witnesses, there's nothing else to document, when it is just a he said, she said situation? Yeah, that is a harder situation. But in the end, an investigator always, in one of these situations, has to make credibility determinations. When you're doing an investigation, you're going to talk to people, you're going to interview them, you're going to ask them questions, you're going to figure out what's going on, and at a certain point, you're going to have to make a decision as to whose story you believe and why. And you have to make that determination. And the mere fact that it's he said, she said should not be a basis for us to say, well, we can't do anything about it. Part of what we have to do as employers is, well, we have to be thorough in looking into this to try and figure out if we can, in fact, make a determination and make a credibility decision. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anya, who's going to continue on talking about Title IX and sex harassment in particular.
Right, thank you, Bob. So let us now dig our heels into sexual harassment a bit. And as some of you may know, there's about a year ago, the Title IX regulations went through a massive overhaul at the federal level. And at its core, what Title IX does is it prevents discrimination or harassment on the basis of sex. And I won't go into too many details here, but Title IX came out about in the 1970s, back when women had far fewer opportunities in school to participate in sports than men did. And so it was meant to fix that. And ever since then, it's grown and it's changed and it's become now part of what sexual harassment and sex-based harassment is, both of which I'm going to talk about in a second. But there's two primary reasons that Title IX in particular is so important. One is because it's the law, and as the school district, we want to follow the law and make sure that we're doing things consistent with the law. But the second is that it applies to all school districts that have any sort of federal funding whatsoever. And so if it turns out that the school is not following Title IX and is permitting sexual harassment or sex-based harassment to occur, you could lose your funding, and it would be rather significant. So we want to make sure we're following the law, we're doing what we need to do, and so part of that is recognizing when Title IX applies. So if we move on to, oh no, sorry, we're still in slide 11. So there's a couple types of sexual harassment that exist. The first is a hostile work environment, and Bob talked about this at length earlier. But here on the slide, the definition of hostile work environment is harassment that is objectively and subjectively offensive and so pervasive or severe that it unreasonably interferes with an employee's work performance or creates a hostile work environment. And this is important because that is a very specific definition, and it's a relatively high standard. It's much, much more, again, as Bob was saying, than an employee being unhappy with the way one of their bosses kind of talks to them. This is the standard for what a hostile work environment actually is. And this is part of that illegal discrimination and harassment that Bob was talking about earlier. So when we talk about sexual harassment, most people think sexual harassment in terms of inappropriate comments, or inappropriate touching, or inappropriate, displays of objects in your office, but it's also sex-based harassment. And so that includes harassment on the basis, or discrimination on the basis of whether you're a man or a woman. And actually recently, under some new interpretive guidance that President Biden released, it also includes gender identity and transgender status. So any discrimination or harassment on those bases are illegal. The second type of sexual harassment is quid pro quo harassment. This is much easier to understand and to recognize when it occurs. And quid pro quo is one of those legal terms that means this or that. I'm sorry, this for that. Tit for tat is essentially what quid pro quo means. And it occurs when an employee's submission to sexual advances is a condition for receiving job benefits or avoiding negative job outcomes. And I'll get to some examples of that in a few slides. So if we turn to slide 12, I have the definition here of hostile work environment again. And the reason I have it here is because there are three important pieces of this definition that I would like to break down. The first is that the harassment must be offensive. The second, that it must be so pervasive or severe. And the third is that it unreasonably interferes with an employee's work performance or creates a hostile work environment. And the reason that I'm breaking these down is because unless all three of those different elements are met, a hostile work environment does not exist. So if two of them are met, we don't have a hostile work environment. We don't have harassment. All three have to be met. So the first part of that definition is whether the behavior, the conduct, the comment, the display, the image, the whatever, was it offensive? And what we use to determine whether something is offensive is what's called a reasonable person standard. And the law talks about a reasonable person all of the time. And it's used in a wide variety of situations. And essentially what it does is say, what would the average person, not you, not your employer, not the employee sitting next to you, but what would an average person, average Joe, if you will, walking down the sidewalk, what would he or she find offensive? And what I have on the next two slides are a list of things that we've either experienced, Bob and I and the other attorneys at the firm during our careers, or things that have come out of cases in Michigan where courts have found, yes, these things are offensive. And a lot of these are really obvious. I mean, comments about someone's body, sexual jokes, pretty obvious things. But there are actually some things on this list I think would be surprising. For example, repeatedly asking someone out who says no. Even if you're not aggressive about it, even if you're not weird about it, if they say no and you continue, courts have found that that can be offensive.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I know, right? It's an opportunity, open invitation. Wow.
Just make the open invitation and stop.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
they have the choice to accept that invitation.
That's interesting, though, yeah.
Yeah, and so, I mean, and also what is not sexual harassment under the law is if someone is open to what you're doing, it's actually not harassment because it's not a situation where they're being harassed or necessarily discriminated against. If you ask someone out and they say yes, and then you don't go out for a couple of months, and then you ask them again, hey, do you still want to go out? They're like, yeah, sure, you're good. It's about it's about the advance being unwanted that makes the difference.
Ms. Lusk, but
Yes.
what if, like, I work with you and Bob,
Mm-hmm.
and there's this going back and forth between the two of you, and you're both receptive to it, but I'm offended and very uncomfortable with it. Does that constitute sexual harassment if it takes place in my presence?
It can possibly because sexual harassment isn't only occurring to the person who is the alleged victim, but actually anybody that sees it as well. So if two people are joking about things and I'm standing over here in the corner, I'm like, that is so inappropriate, that is so uncomfortable, it can be offensive. So it's not just about the person who's doing it or the person who's being done to, but anybody that's overhearing it as well, or can see it, yes. Now again, remember, it's only the first element though, that it's offensive,
Right.
but yes.
And I'm not suggesting that's going on with legal counsel, it was just an example.
Of course.
We tell inappropriate jokes all the time.
Constantly. So slides 13 and 14 are literally, like I said, I mean, this is just a list of stuff. So most of the time, not most of the time I say, but often it's either verbal or written, an inappropriate email, an inappropriate comment, a coworker recounting their sexual history the past weekend. I mean, those are things that are offensive, but it can also be nonverbal. It can be derogatory, offensive facial expressions or comments that meant to convey something sexual. It can be visual, coworkers displaying, suggestive pictures or having a weird background on their phone that they show everybody or a weird desktop saver. And it could also be physical. Massages, don't give other people massages unless, just don't do it, okay? It's been litigated to death, don't do it.
Unless you
I
are
know,
a
right?
masseuse. If you are a masseuse and they come,
Yeah,
Or if someone's like, don't touch me, don't touch them. I mean, obviously things like assault are not appropriate, being followed. But another one that I think that women in particular deal with often, not often, but occasionally, is where they might have a man who crowds their space. They might be standing near a copier and it's just them and the copier and the wall and their space is crowded and there's no touching, nothing inappropriate is said, but that over a period of time, courts have found that to be offensive and meet the definition of offensive. So, all right, turning to the next slide, slide 15. So we figured out what offensive is, and that's the first element of what sexual harassment is, and now we need to figure out whether the offensive behavior, conduct, image, whatever the issue is severe or pervasive. And there's been definitions of these two words in the court, but typically one instance of an inappropriate comment will not rise to the level of sexual harassment unless it is severe. However, so that's the definition of severe, but pervasiveness is the issue that typically gets brought up most often in courts. And that is that even if one instance of relatively minor offensive behavior isn't enough to be sexual harassment, a lot of little instances over a long period of time can very quickly add up. And then we're in pervasive land, and now we've fulfilled the second element of sexual harassment. So this is why it's important that, as Bob was saying earlier, that even if it's only one instance and it's not sexual harassment, Title IX isn't implicated, we still need to address inappropriate behavior in the workplace as it occurs, when it occurs, so that you don't have all those little instances over a period of time adding up to become a problem. Yeah.
And this goes back to the point that Anya was making before, for example, about, you know, a coworker asking another coworker out on a date, right? One time I asked you on a date, like that, maybe that's flattering, it's nice, but no, thank you, I don't want to. But once I say no, thank you, now if a week later you're asking again, when are we going to go on that date?
Right.
You know, all of a sudden now it changes and it begins to feel like, okay, I'm uncomfortable now to be in the same room because I don't
Yes.
want you to ask me about a date again. And so, you know, that's where the one time, no problem. It's people being people, right? But when that continues, then it hits that pervasive, and then it turns from simply people being people to now being harassment. And that's just one example.
I have a question. Does harassment always take place between supervisor and subordinate, or can a male employee harass a female superior?
A male employee can harass a male employee as well, or a male
Right, but I mean,
superior.
can it go from subordinate to superior?
No,
or
it does
just
not. It can be on
superior
the,
to subordinate?
no, not even, it can be on the same level. It can be in subordinate to superior. It can be superior to insubordinate. It could be two people that don't even work in the same department
Okay.
and only passed once, and this unfortunate thing occurred between them.
Real quick on that, though, one point that is important with that, right, is that if it goes from supervisor to someone under them, it imputes liability to the organization.
Oh, okay.
Right, so, because again, in essence, the way it works, right, is if take it in the school context, right, if two teachers are involved in sexual harassment, their superior needs to know about that and be able to report it. Well, if the person whose job it is to report it is the one who is the harasser now, if the principal is harassing the teacher, then essentially what the law says is, well, that's the supervisor. So to this person, you're the organization. And if you're the organization, now it creates potential liability for the organization itself. So it's a really important distinction. So yes, it can happen at any way, but if it happens supervisor to one of their direct reports, it makes it more dangerous
Thank you.
from a liability standpoint.
All right, so let's move on to slide 16. And this is the third element. So the first one was offensive, that the behavior, the conduct must be offensive. The second element of sexual harassment is when whether the harassment was severe or pervasive. And now this is the third element that must be fulfilled in order for in order for the conduct or comment or what have you to be sexual harassment. And there are a number of ways an employee can show that their job has been interfered with. Bob mentioned a couple earlier. If it makes employee feel so uncomfortable they can't perform all or part of their job. If it prevents them from attending work functions to avoid the harasser. So it's possible that the harasser, the person doing the discrimination, they might not run into each other that often at work, but at a work function they will, or they could. And there are a lot of, I think that this is maybe perhaps a little bit less common in school districts, but there's a lot of work functions where your bosses expect you to be there and they expect you to mingle and they expect you to act, and if someone's avoiding that, it can look, from a employer to employee perspective, it can look like they're just refusing to attend work functions because they don't want to. So it can have a negative impact on their job. It might force the employee, harassment can interfere with an employee's job if it forces the employee to give up professional opportunities. If there's a conference across the state and you'll be spending the night, but you're going with the person that's been harassing or discriminating against you, you may say, no, thank you, choose someone else. And now that person's job is impacted and their ability to be, possibly their ability to be promoted or to frankly look good with their employer can take a nosedive. And of course, harassment can interfere with an employee's job if it creates an environment where the employee feels physically or emotionally unsafe. So a good example of this is if an employee hates leaving the building after dark because they're afraid that the harasser is going to be waiting for them in the parking lot. And we know in Michigan it gets dark at about like 3 p.m. in the winter, and so it's usually not an option. So if someone's leaving work early every day because they're trying to avoid this person, it could negatively impact their job. So once all three of those elements, offensive, severe, pervasive, and interference with the employee's job are met, we have sexual harassment. So I'm going to now move on to slide 17 and talk about quid pro quo harassment. And like I said earlier, quid pro quo means this for that or tit for tat. And the longer definition, as I said earlier, it's when an employee must cave to sexual advances in order to receive job benefits or avoid negative job outcomes. And I have 3 examples on this slide for anybody who is not with us. If you go on a date with me, I'll assign you to a better shift. Just one friendly peck and that promotion's all yours. And this one is to avoid negative job outcomes. If you don't send me nude photos, I'll spread rumors about you at work. So those are kind of just 3 examples of quid pro quo sexual harassment that could get you into trouble and again bring liability on the school district if it's occurring.
Ms. Lois, does that have to be directly stated, or can it be passively inferred?
I have to going to defer to Bob on this, but I passively inferred sounds pretty pretty likely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it doesn't have to be directly stated, as long as there's a clear message being sent, right? So it doesn't have to say, there's not a formula, right? If then.
Right.
But if it's made pretty clear,
Right.
you
'Cause
know.
these are pretty direct statements. And,
Right.
And a lot of
Right.
times somebody won't be that direct. So
Right,
they can-
instead of it's a matter of, Debbie, I ask you out on a date and you say no, and then a month later, you're up for a promotion and you don't get it, and I say to you, hey, you had your shot.
Yeah.
Now I'm sending that message. I'm making it clear, and then even that's pretty direct. But there are means by which it can be inferred.
Or
Absolutely.
what if you've asked me out and I've said no, and you've asked once or maybe a couple times, right? And then you say, oh, there's a promotion coming up next month.
Right.
Can I infer that, or is that just difficult to, would you be able to say, hey, I was just letting you know about a
It's-
promotion?
It is possible to infer that. I think. Right.
Maybe we could
And-
go out and talk about your, I mean, that would be more direct, but there could, because a lot of stuff isn't
For sure.
so direct, so.
For sure, and
And that
it's
makes it more difficult to prove, correct?
it does make it more
Right.
difficult to prove.
That posting when you're over there wearing that cute skirt, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Did you see the posting?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
We wanted to state,
Right.
saying wanted to state, hey, did you see the new posting?
Right. Right. And then that's followed up later on with another sort, so yeah, I mean, it doesn't, it does make it harder, it does make it harder to prove, and unfortunately, it also oftentimes, I think, leads people to not report because they think, he could have meant this or he could have meant that.
Absolutely.
And so then they don't report those sorts of things. And it does make it harder to deal with oftentimes, but could it be? Absolutely. And I can tell you that, sometimes it's hard for me. I've learned this over the years. As a man, I talk to my wife about situations or different things, and she's like, well, that's discrimination. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And then she explains it. And I'm like,
Right.
oh yeah, now I see it.
And I think it's good that we're going through these examples too, and that it can be passive, because over time, women have often accepted this as a standard, and they aren't aware that this constitutes harassment or discrimination.
Well, to your point, Debbie, in terms of just those sort of unspoken things, oftentimes power dynamics are going to have a lot of play in that, especially when it comes to the quid pro quo issue, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, in those situations, it is likely always going to be sort of the supervisor and someone underneath, or maybe somebody at least who has more power in the organization. And so it doesn't have to be one gender or another or a situation, but usually there is a power dynamic at work in that situation that can have an effect, especially in an unspoken way. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't have to be that way, right? It could be two people at the same level, and it's like, hey, the supervisor is my best buddy. I can put in a good word for you. It could also be that, right?
Okay.
But
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Also, yeah.
But will you go out with me? We'll talk more about
And
it.
to that point, I think that the idea of avoiding negative job outcomes also falls under the situation where employees are at the same level, running around and spreading rumors, talking poorly about your, that results maybe in a lack of promotion, resulting in you being terminated. And if, if the company was aware that it occurred and they didn't do anything about it, then we could be looking at some quid pro quo. So on to the next point, which I think speaks, Ms. Powell, to a little bit of what you were saying. I think that with the surgence of Me Too, that we have a lot of people who are like, I was just giving a compliment. And they took it too far. This isn't sexual harassment. Nothing I said was bad. It was just nice. And so the question, and this is less legal advice and more just something to keep in mind, because it's about what a reasonable person would find offensive, but it's also a reminder that in the intent of what you say and intent of what you do doesn't matter. What matters is the impact it has on the person that is experiencing it and the impact it has on the surrounding environment, or the people that have overheard it, or the people that hear about it later, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where the reasonable standard person comes in, which in the reasonable standard person has nothing to do with intent, what you intended to say, what you intended to be the result. It's about whether the person receiving it or hearing it would find it offensive. All right, moving on to slide 19, and I was mentioning this a little bit earlier, and since we're kind of in the realm of mostly sexual harassment right now, it's going to be about that. But there is a long living belief that people of the same gender, people of the same sex, people of the same race, people of the same national origin, people of the same color, people of the same religion cannot discriminate against another person that is their sex, gender, religion, etc. And I'm telling you that court after court after court has said, yes, absolutely. An African American person can absolutely discriminate against another African American person because they're African American. It happens all the time. And, but there still is that lingering belief that can't happen. So if you're like, oh, but she's a woman, what do you mean she failed to promote her because she was a woman as well? That can absolutely happen. Right. So don't, if you ever get in that situation, anybody listening, don't think that just because they're of the same, in the same protected class means that discrimination or harassment can occur. All right, moving on to slide 20, who should be reporting? And Bob, again, talked about this a little bit earlier. Any alleged victim should be reporting, and who you report to depends on where you are. If you're at a building level, if you're in central office, any alleged victim should be reporting, and anybody with knowledge of the harassment or anybody that sees the harassment occur should also be reporting it. And this comes in particular importance for Title IX, where if someone saw, even an employee, not even a supervisor, but even if an employee saw something occur and did not report it to the Title IX coordinator, or did not report it to their supervisor, then the district could possibly be looking at liability for having failed to do that. All right, turning to the next slide. So responding to discrimination and harassment. And Bob and I could talk for an entire presentation about exactly what you need to do when you receive a complaint for discrimination or harassment. I'm not going to go into all the details now, but what I do want to point out is that we're first going to talk about everything aside from sex harassment and discrimination with slide 21 here. And Romulus Community Schools has a very explicit and detailed investigation administrative regulation that lays out it defines what harassment is, it defines what discrimination is, and it lays step by step, frankly, in explicit detail, exactly what needs to happen when a claim is made. And so complaints based on discrimination, harassment for everything but sex or sex-based harassment should be reported to Christopher Parker and Marie Gowan, who is the district's civil rights compliance officers. And part of the investigation, what occurs, in what your administrative regulations lay out, and by the way, that's Administrative Regulation 8006.1 and 8006.2 is where that's located. And so if anybody doesn't have, and I'm aware that Romulus doesn't post its administrative regulations online, but I know that, for instance, Paula Gutzman has a copy, and anybody who has these slides is free, of course, to reach out to Bob or me. We'd be happy to provide anybody with another copy of your administrative regulations manual. So what the ARs do is they talk about the manner of investigation, how you have to interview the complainant, how you have to gather supporting evidence, or you have to gather evidence supporting or evidence that doesn't support the complaint. Gather the evidence, talk to the necessary people, figure out who the witnesses are, prepare a comprehensive report of everything all the evidence you've gathered, all the witnesses you've spoken to, the complainant, the person who they're complaining about, and then you need to reach a conclusion. And you report that conclusion to either you can do a conclusion based on, an outside firm can come in and do it if you want like a truly, objective approach, or you can just do it internally via the compliance officers. You report the conclusion to HR, the person's supervisor, and then prompt remedial action, if it's deserved, should occur. And remedial action isn't simply just disciplining the harasser or the person who's discriminating. If discipline is appropriate, it's also providing supports and services for the person who brought the complaint. And I have a bullet here about confidentiality, but actually bring that up later, so I'm going to skip over that for now. So slide 22, now this is the discrimination, and this is responding to discrimination and harassment that occurs because of sexual harassment or sex-based harassment. And this is laid out in Administrative Regulation 8006.3. And again, it lays out the investigation in explicit detail. And I will say that because Title IX controls the investigations for sex and sex-based harassment, the process is actually quite a bit more intricate and complicated than it is for other claims of harassment discrimination. So I don't know if you guys have had a Title IX investigation since the new regulations came out last year, but make sure that you are following to a T that administrative regulation. And the way it differs is it also requires supportive measures for the complainant right off the bat. Like even before an investigation is done, you're supposed to offer support measures for that person. If it's an employee, you can put the employee who's doing the harassing, or who is allegedly, right, because you haven't done an investigation yet, who is allegedly doing the harassment or discriminatory conduct, you can put them potentially on leave while the investigation occurs. For students, it's a little bit more complicated, so you cannot forcibly remove a student from school unless they've shown themselves to be kind of a immediate danger. Do you have a question?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
The support measures would be if someone files a complaint, then the alleged harasser could be placed on leave during the investigation. But how do we balance that with the fact it is alleged? And so how do we protect that employee and their rights? Because of course, placing them on leave, is it also an option to offer a leave to the complainant?
The Title IX regulations specifically talk about putting the respondent, the person who the complaint was made against, on leave. Bob, do you have an opinion on this? It seems.
Because you see how it can make them look.
The hard part about putting the complainant on leave is, I suppose if they volunteered.
That's what I meant. Could we offer?
The hard part is the offering itself can sometimes be perceived as sort of victim blaming or in one way or another.
How about you take a leave?
Yeah, and then they're gonna be like, well, why do I have to? I'm not the one doing the harassing, right? So there is a difficulty. Now, to your point, Debbie, I know we always talk about the idea that an administrative leave pending investigation is not itself disciplinary. So it's not a finding, it's not a scarlet letter on that person. I know people who are accused often feel like it is, though, and that's the hard balance to walk, right? So if I'm being put out on leave, people are going to think that I'm guilty, when the reality is oftentimes that's oftentimes for their benefit as well.
Okay.
Because if they're there, then the other person might say, well, they're interfering with the investigation or this or that. It removes them from the situation. Now, do you have to put them on leave? No. Are there other supportive measures that can be done, separating, making sure that they're not working in the same environments or in different buildings or whatever the case may be? There are different ways to do it. But
Thank you. I know, right?
Do you want to use?
No, let me try this. Let me give you mine.
So my question is, someone's been accused. Okay, we have the accusation. You go through the investigation. comes to find out that there's nothing there. But in doing the investigation while you're interviewing all these other people around, it comes out that, okay, they were just angry at this person. What happens or what can happen to the person that filed this claim and they did it out of anger of, yes, you did a
Yes.
false complaint because you were upset because, okay, he broke up with you.
Right.
You know, one of those workplace
Right.
dating things. What happens from that standpoint?
That's a good question, because is the investigation only to see if that complaint is valid, or is there a consequence for doing it falsely?
Well, I will say for what it's worth that it's a very, maybe shockingly small number of complaints are ever brought for those reasons, thankfully.
But it could be.
No,
Of
it certainly does happen, but I mean.
Vindictiveness?
Yes, thank goodness. I mean, it's only about, I think it's 2 to 4%, so I mean, overwhelmingly small, but it does happen. And if the employee knowingly brings a false claim, that's worthy of discipline.
Yeah, and it's in violation, that itself would be in violation of policy and the law as well.
Okay.
Using the Title IX process, for example, to try and, I mean, that in itself becomes a form of harassment, and so, yes, it would be,
Yeah.
it would be a violation as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Wester. But if you're the one, you don't care that it's far and few between.
Another point, and where I thought you were going to go with that too, is another possibility too is retaliation, right? So retaliation is oftentimes, or is its own violation of policy as well. So let's just say, you know, you accuse me of sexual harassment. In the end, I'm exonerated. I find that there was no harassment, but either along the way during the process or afterward, I retaliate against you for making the claim. That in and of itself is its own, it can be its own violation as well.
It can, and that is explicitly stated in Romulus's ARs near the bottom of each of those ARs I've spoken about that retaliation is absolutely prohibited under the law. So, all right. Summary of discrimination harassment. I'm turning to page 25. So listen and pay close attention to staff complaints. If they say, Jonathan's bugging me, say, why are they bugging you? How often does he bug you? Really get into the details to ensure that you understand the full scope of what's happening. Ask for dates, ask for times, ask for instances, ask for the emails, ask for the text, when you're doing the investigation to make sure that you get everything you can get. Make sure you do the investigation consistent with school district policy and administrative regulations. Again, they're explicit, and any questions, you can always reach out to your legal team to make sure that you're doing it correctly. And so kind of what ties into my first point is do a precursor investigation to determine if the complaint is actually one of discrimination and harassment as those terms are defined under the law. Like Bob was saying earlier, a lot of people claim, I have a hostile work environment, I'm being harassed, you're harassing me, and the word harassment, the word hostile work environment, they have very specific legal meanings that as we discussed tonight. And all reports, any claims of Title IX, do your best to report them to your Title IX coordinator. Any other complaints of discrimination and harassment to the civil rights compliance officers, and that's both Christopher Parker and Renee Gowan. You can report them to either one. And to human resources, then the director of human resources will be the one that has to decide whether to report the issue to the Title IX coordinators or the civil rights compliance officers. So that wraps up the presentation. Are there any additional questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Evans and Ms. Kennard, do either of you have any questions?
I do not.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. Ms. Kennard? I do not think Ms. Kennard has any questions.
All right.
Okay.
Well, then we thank you for the
Thank
opportunity
you,
to
Judy.
be
Ms. Lester,
here.
do you have any questions? No. Thank you. I asked all of my questions, so.
Okay.
Thank you for this, because this is something that obviously we want to understand better and make sure that we are safeguarding our employees. I did have one last question about if somebody feels they are being harassed, you said if they come to us, do they need to follow a chain of command in filing that complaint?
They should follow the chain of command when they report. However, and I think Bob mentioned this earlier, let's say, for example, the person that's being discriminatory or harassing is the principal and you're a teacher. You would typically go to the principal to report that, but, well, I mean, you should also go to the Title IX coordinator and your compliance officers. But what you can do, if that's the case, is you can skip over that person and go to the next person in line.
Right, but you would skip, for that reason, you'd go to HR director or superintendent, but you wouldn't come to board members. And would you follow that chain of command and just go to the next step, or could you just?
Typically, we want to, you know, there is a process in place for how these things are reported. You know, there is a chain of command, and we do recommend that you do follow the chain of command as best you can. There may be situations where your only option is to go right to the superintendent or right to the board president, but you should do your best, you know, the employees should do their best to follow the chain of command as well as they can.
And if it came to the board, would we then make Mr. Parker, Ms. Gowan aware, and then have them take it from there, and we would be?
Yes. So I think 2 points, and Anya's correct, right? Like, the best thing we want is we want it in the hands of the people who know and are trained to deal with these sorts of things, right? But 2 points. One, we can't say, well, they didn't tell the right person, so forget about them, right? So we want to point them in the right direction, maybe. Or, again, when it comes to liability, for example, what's going to be important is, did they tell someone in the organization who has the ability to do something about it?
And we do have to report it.
And so if they came to you, one of you as a board member, and said, hey, this and this is happening, and you were like, not my job, sorry, that's not good enough, right? You have a responsibility to then go to your Title IX coordinator or to HR and say, hey, here's what I'm being told. Because otherwise, you know, we don't want to get into a situation where it's like the whole, not my job.
Right.
Not when it comes to harassment or discrimination. We need to pass that along, because if not, then liability can attach to that person or can attach to the organization as a whole, or both. Because now there's knowledge being done if that's being passed along to somebody who has the ability to do something about it and doesn't.
And my last question is, once the Title IX coordinators are made aware, do they conduct the investigation and make the determination, or is there a checks and balances in that system?
Yeah, so for title, so there is no, I guess, checks and balances, but the idea is that your civil rights compliance officers and your Title IX coordinators should be trained yearly, frankly, at least, so that they understand that objectivity is crucial to doing an investigation. A lot of them also do reach out to outside places to have the investigations done, to ensure that objectivity remains. For Title IX, it's a little bit different. The person that does the investigation is not the person that makes the decision of whether sexual harassment or sex-based harassment has occurred. What they do is they review everything, which is why the investigation is so important, because the person that ends up making the decision for under Title IX isn't the person that interviewed everybody, isn't the person that took notes, isn't the person that, you know, that what they're doing is reading a summary of it. Instead, it's kind of like a judge and a lawyer going to a judge and explain, this is my case, and the judge is like, okay, I can only work with what you've told me, and frankly, how much evidence you've collected and what you've shown me. So, so the person that makes the decision is actually called the decision maker under Title IX, and is not the investigator.
Okay, thank you for that.
And then, too, under Title IX, again, as Anya said, there's a very structured process under Title IX with those new regulations that came out not too long ago. There's also an appeal process, and that has to be to a separate person as well. So if, you know, if a decision maker makes a decision and there's a basis for an appeal, then an appeal can be filed, and there's a third person now who he needs to be sort of the appeal officer. So when it comes to Title IX, there's a very structured process. Normally, for your average, you know, investigation on harassment or discrimination, there isn't that same one, but the federal government has created a very specific process when it comes to Title IX.
Thank you. So if there is a Title IX investigation, the complaint is about a sex harassment or discrimination. If the investigation shows that, no, this person was not harassed based on this, but they were harassed based on one of the other statutes, does that come out of the investigation, or would there have to be a whole nother complaint to say, oh, I filed a, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, typically, I think it makes sense to me, and Bob, please, step in if you disagree, but I think if during the investigation, the person's already doing the investigation, so if they're already talking about the sex-based and sex harassment, may as well talk about the other stuff as well. And also, typically, the person that would have done that investigation, typically it's your Title IX coordinator or your compliance officers who are the same people for your district.
Sure.
So it's entirely possible the same person would have done both investigations anyway. The only caveat to that is that Title IX has very strict deadlines when things must be done. So what we don't want to do is go off on a divergent path that prevents us from making sure that those deadlines are met.
That's a good point. Thank you. Thank you both again, Mr. Schindler and Ms. Lusk. This was informative, and you had a captive audience, not a big one, but but yes,
Oh,
I
dear.
mean, you kept us engaged, so thank you.
Good.
Thank you guys, and we really appreciate the time and being here with you.
Thank you. I am looking online, and I do not see any public comments submitted online. Ms. Garrison, do you have any public comments tonight? Okay. Ms. Wester, do you have any comments? Ms. Evans, do you have any board member comments tonight?
No, I do not.
Thank you. Ms. Kennard, do you have any comments tonight?
No, I do not. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. Dr. Edmondson, if you are with us, do you have any comments? He had to get off. Okay, I do not have any comments other than thank you again. A motion to adjourn. Moved by Piles, supported by, was that Evans?
Yes.
Okay, Madam Secretary, will you please call the roll?
Lester. Yes. Terrell.
Terrell has left the building.
Piles.
Yes.
Kennard. Yes. Evans is yes.
Meeting adjourned at 7:56 p.m.
Have a good night.
Thank you. You too. That was 2 hours ago.
He said he would go in and turn it off.